Snoop didn't grow up with perfect parks. The slide was always busted, the swings rusted, and the ground more glass than grass. So when the city promised a grant to rebuild the playground on 43rd, he quietly covered the difference from his own pocket. No press. No hashtags. Just doing right by the block that raised him. But weeks passed. Then months. No crews, no shovels, no progress, just an empty lot and a locked gate with a laminated sign that read, "Pending additional review." At first, Snoop let the system do its thing. He made calls, sent emails, waited for answers. But when a city official finally responded with, "There's paperwork missing, sir," and tried to brush him off like he was some outsider, Snoop didn't argue. He just showed up the next day with 20 moms, 15 kids, and 3 folding chairs. "Cool," he said, adjusting his shades. "Let's sit here until somebody explains why these kids can't play." The playground on 43rd wasn't much to look at, just a fenced-in patch with a cracked bench and a faded hopscotch outlined someone's older cousin, probably painted back in '06. But it was the only real open space the kids had, and every summer it turned into a battleground of plastic scooters, Nerf darts, and melted popsicles. Snoop passed it at least 3 times a week, sometimes with a coffee, sometimes with his nephew, and every time he looked over, he'd mutter the same thing to himself: "We could make this better." So when a local nonprofit got the city to approve a renovation grant and they reached out for a boost, Snoop said yes without blinking. Quietly dropped some cash. Didn't ask for his name on anything. Didn't need to be in the press. He just wanted to see swings that didn't squeak and turf that didn't burn your knees in July. But that was 5 months ago. And now? Same broken bench. Same locked fence. Only thing new was a bright white city sign taped to the gate saying "Project delayed, administrative processing." The kind of language that meant nothing and everything at once. Snoop didn't walk into the municipal building with bodyguards, cameras, or any publicist in tow. Instead, he moved like a man with too much on his mind and too little patience left for red tape, walking with that steady, unfazed rhythm of someone who's done this before in other rooms, in other cities, in other lifetimes. And when the receptionist at the front glanced up, she looked like she was about to ask his name, then caught herself and just pointed silently toward the 3rd floor, where the Department of Parks and Recreation sat behind walls painted in that government beige that always felt like it belonged to someone who gave up caring years ago. He sat down in the waiting area, old fluorescent lights humming above him, staring at a poster from 2009 about community garden grants, while a clock ticked too loudly above a water cooler that hadn't been refilled, and around him sat no one, just empty chairs and a silence that felt like dust, and yet he waited, calmly, tapping his finger to a rhythm no one else could hear, because he wasn't here to argue or complain, he was here to observe, and Snoop knew that half the battle in these places is watching how they treat people who have nothing flashy attached to their name. When the office door finally opened and someone called him in, he stood and entered without a word, met by a man in his 50s, khaki button-up tucked in too tight, sleeves rolled to the elbows like he wanted to look busier than he was, and the nameplate said G. Everly, Project Liaison, but the man didn't look up, just gestured to a chair and muttered, "Give me a moment," which told Snoop everything he needed to know, that this was someone who was used to holding paper above people, used to hiding behind protocol instead of leading with purpose. When Mr. Everly finally looked up, his eyes flickered with delayed recognition, the kind that wasn't genuine surprise but strategic calibration, and his voice switched from indifferent to overly careful as he said, "Mr. Broadus, yes, of course, thank you for coming in," and then launched into a monologue about procedure, liability, and interdepartmental compliance, using just enough technical jargon to sound official while never actually saying anything useful, and Snoop just listened, arms folded, one brow slightly raised, waiting for the moment the mask would slip and the truth would come out. Eventually, the words landed where they always land: "We're missing some paperwork from the subcontractor," and even though Snoop knew it wasn't true, even though he'd seen the full packet himself before it went through, he didn't interrupt, didn't argue, just let the sentence hang, because sometimes silence forces people to feel the weakness in their own explanations more than confrontation ever could, and after a pause, He simply asked, "Which documents exactly?" and watched as Everly blinked, reached for a file that didn't exist, and muttered something about legal revisions, and Snoop smiled, not because it was funny, but because he'd heard that song before. Snoop leaned back in the chair, calm as ever, and said, "I've been waiting 5 months for somebody to say something real," and Everly opened his mouth to respond, but Snoop cut in, voice low and steady. "You know how many kids pass that park every day? You know what it feels like to see nothing change when the money already there, the plans already drawn, and the only thing in the way is some man behind a desk who don't know what that dirt means to the people who live next to it." And as the silence grew thick, Everly shifted in his seat, not because he was guilty, but because he was uncomfortable with a truth he couldn't hide behind protocol from. Snoop stood, didn't raise his voice, didn't lean in or puff his chest. He just adjusted his hoodie, looked the man straight in the eyes, and said, "This ain't about me, bro. I'm not trying to get credit. I'm not trying to get a street named after me. I just want to know why the only place kids got to run is still behind a locked gate." And when Everly looked down like he suddenly had somewhere else to be, Snoop simply said, "It's cool. If you don't have an answer now, I'll help you find one tomorrow," and he walked out the room before the man could reply, before the excuses could gather strength, because sometimes leaving is louder than staying. Back in the lobby, the hum of lights felt sharper, like the building itself had heard everything, and the receptionist gave Snoop a soft nod, like she understood more than her job required, and as he stepped outside, the city air hit different, thicker with heat and a low buzz of frustration, but also with purpose, because now he knew exactly what needed to happen next. Not another email, not another phone call, but a reminder, not just to Gary Everly, but to the whole building, that people don't forget who's watching. Snoop lit a joint as he walked back to his car, slow and steady, watching the world move around him like a man who wasn't rushing but wasn't stalling either, and in his mind he wasn't planning a protest. He wasn't thinking about going viral, he was just thinking about folding chairs, juice boxes, and mothers who never ask for anything except a patch of safe grass where their kids can laugh without stepping on broken glass. And by the time he reached the driver's seat, the whole idea was already fully formed. The next morning, before most city employees had even clocked in, there were chairs outside the Parks and Rec office, there were families lined up in quiet conversation. There were kids drawing superheroes on the sidewalk with chalk, and in the middle of it all was Snoop, legs crossed, glasses on, calm as Sunday, proving once again that you don't have to yell to be loud, and you don't have to fight to win, you just have to show up with the truth and enough people to witness it. Early Monday morning, while most city workers were still sipping their first coffees and scrolling through unread emails, the wide marble hallway outside the Parks and Rec office began to change. Not with chants or shouting, but with the quiet arrival of folding chairs, juice boxes, and parents holding their kids by the hand, and in the middle of it all was Snoop, standing still, looking around like he was just another neighbor waiting for the building to open, even though everyone knew this wasn't a visit, it was a statement, because when you can't get answers from behind closed doors, sometimes you bring the people who are affected the most and wait for those doors to open themselves. There were no protest signs, no t-shirts with slogans, no chants, and no hashtags, just 20-something people quietly sitting in a line of chairs brought from home, a cooler of juice and water for the kids, and one little speaker playing soft music in the background, not to draw attention but to fill the awkward quiet that government buildings seem to naturally create. And this wasn't a planned rally, no tweets had gone out, no news vans parked out front, just presence, pure and deliberate, the kind that makes people uncomfortable not because it's loud, but because it makes them ask themselves why it's even necessary. Between 9 o'clock and 10:15 a.m., 7 different employees walked past the group on their way to various meetings or coffee runs, some offering awkward smiles, some pretending to be deep in conversation with no one on the phone, and none of them stopped. None of them asked what was going on, because they knew exactly what it was. And it was easier to act like it wasn't happening, because to acknowledge it would mean acknowledging that a group of local families had felt ignored enough to show up and sit in a hallway for hours just to get someone to say, "We see you." As the morning went on, one of the moms tried to change her baby's diaper but couldn't find a restroom with a changing table, and another asked a front desk worker for a chair and was told, We're not allowed to move building furniture, while a toddler sat quietly on the tile floor drawing with crayons on a folder from his mom's work bag, and all of it, the restrictions, the cold tile, the absence of comfort, made it clearer than ever that these buildings weren't designed for the people who actually lived in the neighborhoods their policies affected, and that disconnect was louder than any complaint. Snoop didn't pace, didn't lecture, didn't pull out a phone to document the moment. Instead, he sat cross-legged in a folding chair near the center, sunglasses on, hoodie up, nodding along to the music as he answered questions from a couple of curious kids about whether superheroes get tired, and every so often he'd glance at the big double doors leading to the offices, not impatient, not angry, just aware, because the best kind of pressure is the kind that doesn't flinch, the kind that stays calm while everyone else gets nervous wondering what you're waiting for. By 11:30, a city hall staffer who had nothing to do with Parks and Rec stepped out of the elevator and did a double take, then leaned over to someone at the front desk and whispered, "Is that Snoop?" And when the answer came back with a nod and a quiet "They've been here since before 9, the ripple began to form. Because a name like that sitting quietly in the hallway with a group of neighborhood families doesn't stay a whisper for long, not because he's famous, but because he's not supposed to have to sit and wait like everyone else. And the fact that he chooses to do it means everyone else has no excuse. At 12:06, a man in a too-tight tie and stiff smile finally opened the glass doors, cleared his throat, and said, "Mr. Broadus, we'd love to invite you inside for a quick conversation." But Snoop didn't move right away. He glanced at the moms, the kids, the dads who had taken their lunch breaks to sit in solidarity, and then said, "Nah, I think we good right here. If y'all got something to say, y'all can say it in front of the people who've been waiting longer than me." And the man's smile didn't fade, but it cracked, because power doesn't always look like volume. It looks like someone who refuses to be moved from the truth. After a short back and forth where the official tried to politely insist, Snoop stood up, not to escalate, but to remove any confusion, and said calmly, "The only thing I need to hear is when them kids on 43rd get to play without climbing a locked gate." And the moment that line hit the air, two people standing near the elevators pulled out their phones, not because Snoop asked, but because they realized this wasn't a protest, this was a mirror, and some moments demand to be recorded not for clout, but for accountability, and that's when the atmosphere shifted from inconvenience to spotlight. By 1:15 p.m., someone had made a call they weren't planning to make, and someone above Gary Everly's level had gotten involved, because the building suddenly got more tense, more alert, and staff began walking faster, whispering more, peeking out of doors before stepping into hallways, because what started as a silent sit-in had now become a visible problem, and the higher-ups knew that the longer they waited to resolve it, the worse it would look, not because of who Snoop was, but because of who he was sitting with. At 2:37 p.m., a new official stepped forward, someone no one had seen before that day, clipboard in hand, voice too careful, saying, "We're happy to announce the 43rd project has been cleared and scheduled for groundwork this week." And while a couple of the parents clapped softly, Snoop didn't smile or nod. He just looked the man in the eye and said, "Good. Then we'll be out your hallway." And just like that, the chairs folded, the cooler closed, the crayons picked up, and the silence that filled the hallway as they left was louder than any speech. Because when the people finally get what they deserve, there's no need to gloat, just to go home knowing you didn't ask, you made it clear. At exactly 12:08 p.m., a city employee on her lunch break posted a grainy photo of the hallway on her private Instagram story with the simple caption, "Snoop and 30 moms just chillin' in our office eyes." And even though she had no intention of going viral, the algorithm had other plans, because by the time she came back with her salad, that story had been screenshotted, reposted, and dropped into 2 local Facebook groups, 3 Reddit threads, and a group chat titled City Hall Tea. At 1:10 p.m., an intern at a local news outlet got a ping from a group thread with the screenshot and replied on it before his editor even finished typing, and within 15 minutes he had his tripod, mic, and 2 spare batteries loaded into his dusty Toyota, not because he thought it would be some hard-hitting expose, but because he knew that if Snoop Dogg was sitting on a folding chair outside a government office, it probably wasn't for laughs, and even if it was, the internet was about to care. By 2 p.m., there were already mock-up headlines floating through news Slack channels across LA, Snoop Dogg's City Hall, Broadus versus Bureaucracy, Parked in Protest, none of which were accurate, all of which sounded juicy, because nobody had talked to him yet, and nobody really cared what the actual story was, but they all agreed on one thing: he was there, and the city had some explaining to do. The internal city council WhatsApp pinged at a pace it hadn't seen since the last budget scandal, with council members sending panicked messages like, "Is this real?" and "Why didn't anyone flag this earlier?" While one brave assistant dropped a link to the original grant document for the 43rd playground with a timestamp that read "Approved 5 months ago," and for the first time in a long time, people in power realized they were out of the loop, not because they missed a vote, but because they forgot. People remember silence longer than excuses. At 2:45, 4 officials gathered in a second-floor conference room to figure out a response strategy, debating whether they should release a statement, send a representative, or just hope it would blow over by dinner. But what none of them seemed to grasp was that the story wasn't just about Snoop, or even the playground. It was about parents who'd been ignored, kids who'd been locked out of play, and a hallway filled with patients that had outplayed every press release they could possibly draft. Back in the hallway, Snoop still hadn't taken out his phone, hadn't spoken to any cameras, hadn't even looked toward the journalist who had quietly started filming from the side. He just sat, hoodie still up, legs crossed, chatting with a grandma about lemon pound cake while one of the younger dads passed out crackers to restless toddlers. And it was that calm, that refusal to act like a spectacle, that made the moment powerful, because it didn't need to be spun or captioned, it just was, and everyone watching could feel it. At 3:10 p.m., the first full camera crew arrived with a boom mic and a question that wasn't really a question. "Mr. Broadus, can you explain what brought you here today?" And Snoop didn't stand, didn't pose, didn't even move much. He just looked into the lens and said, "Some kid's been staring through a fence for 5 months, waiting on a playground the city already paid for. We here to find out why." And the moment that clip hit the internet, it didn't trend because it was dramatic, it trended because it was undeniably honest. By 3:30, folks who didn't even live near 43rd were showing up with water bottles, lawn chairs, and toddlers in tow, not to make noise, but to show solidarity. Because when you hear that the system left your neighbor waiting, you start thinking maybe it did the same to you, and suddenly the hallway felt like a neighborhood block, a calm crowd of people who all had the same question: if this is what it takes for Snoop to get a park fixed, what hope do the rest of us have? Inside the Parks and Rec office, no one was laughing anymore, not even Gary Everly, who had been refreshing his inbox every 30 seconds and wiping sweat from his upper lip as he tried to figure out who let this get this far. And meanwhile, his supervisor's supervisor was asking, "Do we have a crisis protocol for this?" And someone replied, "For what?" Folding chairs, and it was that line, the realization that it wasn't a protest but a presence, that finally made the phone start ringing in the right rooms. By 4 p.m., the narrative had already left their control, not because someone made a speech, but because no one had to. And Snoop stood up for the first time that hour, not to address a crowd or talk to a reporter, but to stretch his back and help a little girl find her dropped crayon. And in that tiny motion, every camera caught what words couldn't, that this was never about clout, never about fame, never even about him. It was about community showing up without a permit, without permission, and leaving behind something more powerful than paperwork, proof that quiet resistance can be the loudest kind. At exactly 7:41 the next morning, long before most of the neighborhood had poured their cereal or turned on the news, a city truck rumbled to a slow stop on the corner of 43rd and Redondo, followed by a flatbed trailer carrying fencing, equipment, cones, and 3 guys in high-vis jackets who looked around like they weren't expecting anyone to be watching. But 2 women on a porch across the street were already there with coffee in hand, one of them whispering, "He really did it," before texting her sister, because after 5 months of silence, all it took was one quiet hallway sit-in to move what meetings couldn't. The moment the first orange cone touched pavement and the metallic hum of a power auger kicked in, a few neighborhood kids came jogging up barefoot, eyes wide and mouths hanging open at the sight of real machinery, real tools, and actual grown men doing something that looked like progress. And while no ribbon was cut, no speeches made, and no cameras in sight, the moment one of the workers started spraying chalk lines across the dirt, it felt like justice finally made a sound. Snoop pulled up around 9:20 in a plain navy hoodie and some worn-in chucks. No entourage, no camera crew, just a single head nod to the foreman who looked up mid-hammer. And instead of stepping into the lot or trying to take credit, he leaned against the fence, lit one, and watched like a man who'd finally seen a promise leave the inbox and touch real ground. And even as a few neighbors started to trickle out to say thanks, he kept it simple, smiling, nodding, but always pointing back toward the crew like they were the ones who deserved the moment. A group of 5 kids sat cross-legged on the sidewalk, watching the backhoe lower its arm into the soil like it was some kind of transformer, and one of them, no older than 9, leaned over to his friend and asked, "Why they building this now?" And another replied, "'Cause Uncle Snoop sat in some chairs," and even if the retelling lacked detail, it didn't lack truth, because kids understand results better than reasoning. And what they saw that day wasn't politics or funding cycles, it was movement. One of the construction guys, wiping sweat from his neck, walked over to Snoop with a kind of cautious respect and said, "They told us this project was stalled," and Snoop didn't smirk, didn't brag, just looked him in the eye and said, "Sometimes you gotta let people remember who this space belongs to," and it wasn't a line meant to impress. It was a quiet reminder that neighborhoods don't need to shout when they stand together, they just need one open gate and someone bold enough to knock. By 11:15 a.m., someone from the city communications office arrived in khakis and a tucked-in polo with a DSLR and the nervous energy of someone who showed up too late to the real story, asking the crew if they could get a few shots for the official newsletter, but nobody posed, nobody smiled for the lens, and when the photographer asked Snoop if he'd mind stepping into a group shot, he just said, "Nah, I think the fence already tells the story," and went back to watching the swings get unpacked. From plastic. A grandma from 2 houses down rolled up slow with her walker and just stood beside Snoop without saying a word for a full minute before finally muttering, "I didn't think they'd actually do it." And he turned to her gently and replied, "They didn't, we did," and she nodded, one hand shaking slightly on the walker handle, her eyes never leaving the dirt. Because sometimes the people who've seen the most disappointment need to witness one small victory to believe again. Around noon, one of the dads who'd sat outside the city office the day before walked up with his daughter and said, "You think they would have done it if you hadn't shown up?" And Snoop didn't say yes or no, just shrugged and replied, "I think they forgot who they work for," and that answer was enough, because in neighborhoods like this, people don't need heroes, they need reminders, and that fence going up wasn't just metal and bolts, it was a receipt. Progress wasn't flashy that day, it was slow, gritty, noisy, and hot, with sawdust floating through the air and the smell of sun on plastic tarps, but to everyone watching, it was beautiful, not because it was perfect, but because it was finally happening, and in every screw drilled, and every plank laid, and every chain tightened on the new swing set, the people watching didn't just see a playground. They saw a system moved not by policy, but by people who refused to sit down until someone stood up. Snoop didn't stay all day. He stayed long enough to see the surface start to form, the equipment roll in, and the first pieces of a future begin to take shape, and as he turned to walk back to his car, he passed a group of teens who didn't even say hi, just nodded at him like they'd seen what they needed to, and he nodded back like he understood, and that was enough, because not every act of change needs a press release. Sometimes it just needs a morning, a memory, and a man who knew the power of showing up. 2 weeks later, the park was open. Not perfect, but real, brand new turf, swings that didn't squeak, a slide that actually slid, and benches that didn't wobble when someone sat down. Snoop passed by quietly one afternoon, hood up, drink in hand, and watched from across the street as a group of kids raced to the monkey bars, arguing over who got there first. No one noticed him, and he didn't need them to. One of the moms saw him though, raised a hand in the air, and mouthed "thank you." He just nodded once, smiled, and kept walking. Because he didn't do it to be seen. He did it so they could be. There were no plaques. No mayoral tweets. No credit on paper. Just a park that finally worked, a street that felt a little more like home, and a reminder that sometimes the loudest change comes from people who refuse to make noise until it's absolutely necessary. Snoop didn't change the system, but he made it move. And in neighborhoods like his, that's more than enough.